Hello, my name is Nathan Whitman, 32 years old. I am the founder of a technology company valued at over $200 million. I live in San Francisco, where steep streets lead you from glittering skyscrapers down to the windswept bay, where morning fog clings to every corner like a whisper from the ocean. This city never stands still. It's alive, chaotic, and full of ambition, much like I am now. But if you ask me where I'm from, I'll take you back to a different place. A much simpler one, Chapel Hill, North Carolina. There, amidst tree-lined streets shaded by oaks and old wooden houses, I grew up not as Nathan Whitman, but as Nathan Ellis, a boy who once thought the entire world was his backyard until it all came crashing down. I'm not telling this story to boast about what I've achieved. No, I'm sharing it because I want you to understand. Understand that sometimes the deepest wounds are what lead you to places you never dared to dream of. But to get here, I had to walk through dark days. Days when pain was a constant companion that never left. Let me start from the beginning. From the years when memories were still as sharp as a blade. I was born in Chapel Hill, a small town with quiet streets where everyone knew each other's names, and summer afternoons passed with the hum of cicadas. My home was at the end of a dirt road, a two-story house with a wooden porch and a garden full of flowers that my mother tended to daily. My father, Michael Ellis, was a general practitioner, a tall man with a warm smile and eyes that sparkled as if they could speak. He was the kind of person who, when he walked into a room, made you feel like everything would be okay. He would scoop me and my sister Lily into his arms, telling stories about the patients he'd helped, or simply singing silly songs to make us laugh. My mother, Rachel, was a gentle woman with golden blonde hair and a voice as soft as the breeze. She loved my father, loved us, and loved that house. At least, that's what I believed. I remember Sunday mornings when the whole family would gather around the kitchen table, the smell of toasted bread and coffee filling the air. Lily, 3 years younger than me, would sit scribbling drawings on paper while I busied myself assembling model airplanes from scraps of wood my father brought home. That was my world, safe, warm, and unbreakable. But I was wrong. When I was 11, everything changed. It was an April afternoon, the sky gray, as if foreshadowing something, and my father came home from the clinic as usual. But that day, he didn't rush to hug us. He walked in, collapsed into a chair, clutching his chest, his breathing labored. I remember my mother panicking, calling for an ambulance, her voice breaking with sobs. Lily and I stood huddled in a corner of the room, holding hands tightly, not understanding what was happening. My father was taken to the hospital, but just a few hours later, he was gone. A heart attack, a cold, impersonal term, and it took away the man I thought was invincible. The days that followed were a blur. I remember neighbors coming to our house, bringing food and words of comfort I didn't care to hear. My mother barely left her bedroom, lying there, staring blankly at the ceiling. Lily only ate, kept asking me, "Will Dad come back, Nate?" I didn't know how to answer, so I just held her tightly and lied, saying everything would be okay. But deep down, I knew nothing was okay anymore. My father left us some money, not a fortune, but enough for my mother not to worry about finances for a while. He also left a void that could never be filled. I began to notice my mother was no longer the woman I knew. She became distant, her eyes empty, as if her soul had followed my father. I tried everything to make her smile. I cleaned the house, cooked simple meals, even told the funny stories my father used to share, but she would only give a faint smile before turning away. 3 years passed, and I was 14. My mother, she started going out more, dressing up, and sometimes coming home with a smile I no longer recognized. Then one day, she brought home a man. His name was Mark. Mark was nothing like my father. He was short, thin, with slicked back hair and cold, sharp eyes like a knife. He spoke to my mother in a sweet tone, but when he looked at me and Lily, his gaze was filled with contempt. "Kids," he once said to my mother, as if we were an inconvenience to be rid of. I hated the way he walked into our house, sat in my father's chair, and acted like he belonged there. But my mother, she looked at him as if he were the only light in her dark world. I tried to endure it. I thought if my mother was happy, Lily and I would be okay. But I was wrong. Mark didn't just dislike us. He wanted us gone. I started overhearing whispered conversations between him and my mother at night when they thought we were asleep. "Rachel, don't you see? The kids are a burden. We need a fresh start." Just you and me. I lay in bed, my heart pounding, trying to keep Lily from hearing. But my little sister, though young, sensed something was wrong. Nate, does Mom still love us? She asked, her voice trembling. I didn't answer because I wasn't sure anymore. Then one day, my mother called Lily and me into the living room. She sat on the sofa, Mark standing behind her, his hands on her shoulders like a claim of ownership. Nathan, Lily, she began, her voice shaky. I've been thinking a lot. I think it would be better if you both went to live with your grandparents for a while. I felt the floor collapse beneath me. Live with our grandparents. I repeated, my voice breaking. But this is our home. You're our mother. She looked down, avoiding my eyes. I know, she whispered. But I need time. Mark and we need to build a new life. Just for a while, Nate. I promise. I wanted to scream, to ask her why she was choosing him over us, but I couldn't. I looked at Lily, saw her clutching the old doll our father had given her, tears streaming down her cheeks. I took her hand, trying to keep my voice steady. Okay, Mom, we'll go. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat on my bed, looking around my room. The model airplanes, the scribbled drawings Lily and I had made together. The family photo from a beach trip when Dad was still alive. I wanted to smash everything, to run to my mother and beg her not to do this. But I didn't. I quietly packed clothes, books, and my father's keepsakes into an old suitcase. I knew in that moment I hadn't just lost my father. I'd lost my mother, too. The next morning, Mark drove us to our grandparents' house, 2 hours from Chapel Hill. He didn't say a word the entire drive, just played the radio and nodded along to the music. My mother sat in the front seat, silent, her hands clasped tightly together. Lily and I sat in the back, holding hands, not speaking. When the car pulled up to our grandparents' old wooden house, my mother gave us a brief hug. I'll visit soon, she said, but her voice carried no conviction. Mark didn't even get out of the car. He honked the horn, and my mother hurried back to the car as if she couldn't wait to get away from us. I stood there, holding Lily's hand, watching the car disappear down the road. That was the first time I felt the world was no longer a safe place. I was 14, Lily was 11, and we had been left behind. Our grandparents' house sat on the edge of a small town, surrounded by endless cornfields. The old wooden house had a weathered tile roof and a creaking porch that groaned with every gust of wind. My grandmother Margaret stood at the door, her arms wide open, her smile as warm as sunlight. Oh, my dear grandchildren, she said, pulling us into her embrace. The smell of freshly baked cookies and lavender perfume wafted from her clothes. In that moment, I felt like I was home again. But my grandfather, Harold, was a different story. He stood at the threshold, tall and gaunt, with white hair and eyes as sharp as a striker knife. He didn't say anything, just nodded at us and turned back into the house. Don't be afraid of him, Grandma Margaret whispered. Your grandfather is just strict, but he loves you. I wasn't so sure, but I nodded, pulling Lily into the house. This was our new beginning, and I knew it wouldn't be easy. The house of my grandparents was like a completely different world compared to our old home in Chapel Hill. Here, in the old wooden house, amidst endless cornfields, the air was fresh, gentle, and it felt as though time moved slowly. The wooden walls creaked with every gust of wind, and the musty smell mingled with the scent of Grandma Margaret's cookies, creating a strange fragrance that was both familiar and unfamiliar. I held Lily's hand tightly as we crossed the threshold, feeling her small hand tremble in mine. Nate, are we going to stay here forever? She whispered, her big, round eyes looking at me as if pleading for help. I wanted to say no, to promise that we'd soon return home, but the words caught in my throat. Instead, I just squeezed her hand and smiled. It'll be okay, Lily. I'm here. Grandma Margaret led us upstairs through a narrow wooden staircase to 2 small rooms prepared for us. My room had a single bed, an old wooden desk, and a window overlooking the cornfield stretching to the horizon. Lily's room was next door with a floral quilt Grandma had sewn herself and a cloth doll placed on the pillow. I've prepared everything for you, she said, her voice gentle, but her eyes tinged with sadness. Rest a bit, then come down for dinner with us. She hugged us, a tight and warm embrace, as if she were trying to make up for what our mother had left behind. I wanted to stay in her arms forever, but I knew I had to be strong for Lily. That evening, We sat around the wooden table in the kitchen where Grandma Margaret laid out a simple but warm meal: mashed potatoes, boiled green beans, and golden cornbread. She told stories about her youth, how she and Grandpa Harold met at a county fair, and how he made her laugh with his clever but clumsy remarks. "He's not always so stern," she said, glancing at Grandpa Harold, who sat at the head of the table, silently eating small bites. He didn't join in the conversation, only occasionally nodding or muttering something when she mentioned the past. I looked at him, trying to find traces of the love Grandma spoke of, but all I saw was a cold, distant man with eyes that seemed to look through us to a place I couldn't reach. The first days at our grandparents' house passed in a strange rhythm. Grandma Margaret was the light of the house. She taught Lily how to bake, sang old folk songs, and told stories about the sparrows in the garden. With me, she listened patiently as I talked about school or the model airplanes I used to build with Dad. Sometimes I caught her quietly wiping away tears. "You're like your father," she once said, placing a hand on my shoulder. "I'm proud to have had a son-in-law like him. He was always trying to make things better." Her words made my heart ache, but also gave me a glimmer of hope, as if Dad was still out there somewhere, watching over me. But Grandpa Harold was different. He was a silent shadow in the house. He spent most of his time in a small room at the end of the hallway, which he called his study. The door was always closed, and Grandma Margaret told us not to go in there. "Your grandfather needs his own space," she said, but I could sense the worry in her voice. I was curious, but also afraid. Once, as I passed by, I heard him muttering as if arguing with himself, mixed with the sound of rustling papers and clinking metal. Another time I saw him standing on the porch at night, staring at the starry sky, his thin shoulders trembling as if he were crying. I didn't dare ask, but I began to wonder who he was and why he carried a look as if the world owed him an apology. We started attending a new school, a small one in town with only a few classrooms, old hallways, and a bell that sounded like it belonged to a bygone era. I always felt out of place. New faces, unfamiliar stares, names I couldn't remember. I didn't know anyone and didn't know how to start a conversation. I missed my old school with its tall, shady trees and the classroom with large windows overlooking the soccer field where I used to sit with close friends who were now just memories. During recess at the new school, I often sat alone on the edge of the playground, watching the other kids play while feeling like an outsider. Lily adapted faster than I did. She found joy in the little things, helping Grandma pick beans in the garden, chasing rabbits in the fields, or sitting with her to hear bedtime stories. But I couldn't. I missed home, missed Mom, missed the days when everything was simple. Every night I lay in bed, staring out the window, wondering if Mom would really come visit as she'd promised. I wrote letters to her, telling her about our days here, about Grandma Margaret, about Grandpa Harold, but I didn't send them. I was afraid she wouldn't reply, or worse, that she'd reply saying she didn't want us back. One afternoon, about 2 months after we moved in, I decided to talk to Grandpa Harold. I don't know why, but I felt that if I didn't do something, I'd be stuck in this helpless feeling forever. I knocked on the door of his study, my heart pounding. There was no answer, but I heard noises inside, the scratch of a pencil on paper, muttering. I pushed the door open just a crack and peeked in. Grandpa Harold was sitting at an old wooden desk, surrounded by scattered drawings, papers, and strange devices I'd never seen before. There were test tubes, wires, and an old computer with a flickering screen. He looked up, his eyes sharp and cold. "Who let you in here?" he snapped, his voice low and angry. I slammed the door shut and ran back to my room, my heart racing. But the image of that room haunted me. The drawings, the formulas, the devices, they were unlike anything I'd seen at school. They had a strange beauty, as if they held the secrets of the universe. And I began to realize that Grandpa Harold wasn't just an eccentric old man. He was someone who once had big dreams, but for some reason had been forgotten by the world. Over the next few months, I tried to find ways to connect with him. I started with small things, bringing him coffee in the morning, asking about the weather, or quietly tidying the garden so he wouldn't have to. He didn't say much, but sometimes he'd nod or mutter a thank you. That was all I got, but it was enough to keep me from giving up. I began to notice how he worked, how he spent hours hunched over drawings, muttering about systems and formulas, how he stared out at the cornfields with a mix of anger and pain. I didn't understand him, but I wanted to. Deep down, I felt we had something in common. Both of us had been left behind by the world. Grandma Margaret was the bridge between us. She told me about Grandpa Harold's past. He had been a scientist, a pioneer in applied physics. He worked at a major laboratory, developing ideas that could have changed the world, from clean energy to data prediction systems. But disputes with colleagues, disagreements with superiors, and a copyright lawsuit had cost him everything. He never got over it, she said, her voice heavy with sadness. He feels the world betrayed him. I listened, feeling a strange sense of empathy. I too had felt betrayed by Mom, by Mark, by life itself. Lily, meanwhile, became the joy of the household. She started calling Grandpa Harold Grumpy Grandpa, and sometimes her innocent remarks made him laugh. Once she brought a bouquet of wildflowers into the house and placed it on his desk. "To make you happier," she said, and I saw the corner of his eyes glisten. That was the first time I saw a hint of humanity in him, not just a shadow. But not every day here was filled with light. I began to notice something was wrong with Grandma Margaret. Every morning, after setting a plate of hot cornbread on the table and pouring tea, she would quietly take a small bottle of pills from a kitchen drawer, swallow a few with a sip of water, and smile at me and Lily as if nothing was wrong. At first, I thought they were just vitamins, but the way she hid the bottle, the fleeting anxiety in her eyes when she thought no one was looking, made me suspicious. One day when she was out in the garden picking beans, I sneaked a look at the bottle. The label had a long, complicated name, but the folded paper inside had the words cardiovascular disease in bold. My heart sank. Cardiovascular disease, the illness that took my father. I stood there, hands trembling as I held the bottle, feeling like the world was about to collapse again. I didn't dare ask her. I was afraid that if I spoke, I'd make her sad, or worse, I'd have to face the truth that she might leave us. Instead, I watched her more closely. She was still gentle, still sang softly while baking. But I noticed she was more tired, her steps slower, and sometimes she'd pause, placing a hand on her chest as if to soothe an invisible pain. Lily remained carefree, still clinging to her, asking for stories about the sparrows. But I carried a silent fear in my heart, the fear of losing the woman who had given me and Lily a home when our mother abandoned us. The months that followed were like walking a tightrope, constantly tense, waiting for something terrible to happen. Every time Grandma Margaret paused to catch her breath, every time she coughed or sat longer than usual, my heart clenched. I started keeping a small notebook, recording her good and bad days as if writing them down could stop time. Today she laughed a lot, baked cookies with Lily, I wrote. Or, today she slept all afternoon, looked exhausted. I didn't know why I did it, but maybe I thought that if I understood her illness, I could do something to keep her with us. Grandpa Harold seemed to notice, too, but he never said anything. He kept his cold demeanor, spending most of his time in his study with the door closed, only coming out for dinner or to check on the cornfields. But I started noticing small changes. He would watch her longer. His eyes, no longer sharp, were filled with worry. Once I saw him hold her hand as she sat in the armchair, his thin fingers gripping hers tightly, as if afraid she'd vanish. Those moments made me realize he wasn't just an eccentric old man. He loved her deeply and quietly in his own way. Lily, with the innocence of an 11-year-old, remained the light of the house. She didn't know about the pill bottle or the words cardiovascular disease I'd read in secret. She still followed Grandma, begging for stories, learning to sew, and sometimes even pulling Grandpa Harold into her silly games. "Grandpa, make a bunny face," she'd laugh. And I was surprised to see him reluctantly raise an eyebrow, making a goofy expression that sent Lily into giggles. Those moments were rare, but they made me think that maybe deep down there was still a part of him that hadn't been consumed by resentment. In the fall of my 17th year, everything fell apart. It was an October morning, the air crisp, the oak leaves outside turning a brilliant gold. Grandma Margaret got up early as usual, but I noticed she was slower, her face pale. She tried to smile, setting a plate of cornbread on the table. But as she turned to get the teapot, I saw her stumble. "Grandma," I shouted, rushing to catch her. She grabbed my hand, gasping, her other hand clutching her chest. "Nate, it's okay," she whispered, but her voice was faint, like a breeze about to fade. I panicked, calling for Grandpa Harold, but he was already there, his face ashen. He helped her sit, his voice trembling. Margaret, hold on. I'm calling the doctor. But no doctor arrived in time. Grandma Margaret collapsed in his arms, her eyes closing, a final smile lingering on her lips. I stood there, frozen, hearing Lily's sobs from somewhere in the house. Grandpa Harold held her tightly, silent. Not a single tear, but I saw his shoulders tremble as if his entire world had just shattered. I wanted to run to them, to scream, to do anything to change that moment, but I just stood there, feeling my heart being crushed. She passed away in that kitchen, the place once filled with laughter and the smell of cookies. Cardiovascular disease, like a curse, had taken her from us, just as it had taken my father. I was 17, and I had lost another person I thought would always be there. On the day of Grandma's funeral, a light drizzle fell as if the sky itself were weeping. Lily and I stood by the coffin, holding hands, our eyes red and swollen. Relatives from all over came, along with old neighbors from the small town, bringing cookies and words of comfort. I heard them talk about Grandma, about her smile, how she helped them plant flowers or care for their children. But deep down, Lily and I only wanted one thing: for Mom to show up. I imagined her walking in, hugging us, saying she was sorry, that she still loved us. Every time the church door opened, I turned, my heart pounding, hoping to see her silhouette. Lily did the same, gripping my hand tightly, whispering, "Mom's coming, right, Nate?" I nodded, but each time the door opened and it wasn't Mom, I felt another knife twist in my heart. All day, relatives and neighbors came to bid Grandma farewell, but Mom never showed. Not a letter, not a call, not a single sign that she would appear. I stood in the rain, watching Grandma's coffin being lowered, and felt the sting of abandonment rise again, sharper than ever. Lily cried beside me, her head resting on my shoulder, and I hugged her, whispering that we still had each other. But deep down, I knew a part of me had closed off, the part that still hoped Mom would come back. The days that followed were a blur. The house became cold, as if its soul had left with her. Lily cried until she had no tears left, clutching the cloth doll Grandma had made, refusing to leave her room. I tried to comfort her, but I didn't know how to handle the pain tearing through my chest. Grandpa Harold disappeared into his study, the door shut tight, not saying a word. I heard him muttering through the door, the rustle of papers, the clink of metal, but I didn't dare knock. I was afraid I'd see a man completely broken. A week after the funeral, he called Lily and me into the living room. He sat in Grandma's old armchair, holding a cold cup of coffee, his eyes empty. "Things will be different from now on," he said, his voice dry. "You kids need to learn to stand on your own 2 feet. I don't have time to coddle you." I nodded, though I wanted to scream that we were hurting too, that we'd lost her too. Lily held my hand, her eyes red, but she didn't say anything. That's when Grandpa Harold changed. He became harsher than ever. Every morning, he knocked on my door at 5 o'clock, dragging me out of bed. "Get up, Nathan. The world doesn't wait for the lazy," he'd say, his voice sharp. He made me read science books, thick tomes on physics, mathematics, and engineering, things I only partially understood. He banned me from using the phone, from meeting friends, from anything he called a distraction. "If you want to survive, you have to be sharp," he'd say, his eyes piercing through me. I hated him for it, but I didn't dare defy him. I saw the pain in his eyes, and I knew he was taking it out on me, as if his harshness could ease his loss. Lily was treated more gently, but not by much. He made her study math and read books, even though she just wanted to draw or play in the garden. "Your grandmother wanted you to be strong," he'd say whenever Lily protested. I saw her try, but the spark in her eyes was fading. I began to worry she'd lose the innocence Grandma had cherished. But in that harshness, I started to see something else in Grandpa Harold. One evening, when I sneaked into his study, a habit by now, I found an old, worn leather notebook filled with his handwritten notes. They weren't just formulas or technical drawings, but his thoughts about the inventions he dreamed of, the failures that had crushed him, the way the world had turned its back on him. "I wanted to change the future, but they only wanted money," he wrote on one page. I read, and for the first time, I felt a connection with him. Not as a grandfather, but as someone who'd been hurt, who'd wanted to prove something. I started copying his ideas, the drawings of energy systems, the data prediction formulas, the rusted devices he'd abandoned. They were like a forgotten treasure. I didn't understand everything, but I learned. I spent hours in the study under a dim lamp, trying to decipher the numbers and symbols. Once he caught me, but instead of yelling, he just stood there, looking at me with a strange expression. "You think you're smart enough to understand this stuff?" he asked. I nodded, though I wasn't sure. He didn't say anything else, just turned away, but I felt a small glimmer of acknowledgement. Those years I lived under Grandpa Harold's iron discipline, but also with a growing fire inside me. I began to see the greatness in his ideas, not because they were perfect, but because they were proof of a man who dared to dream big, even when the world rejected him. I promised myself I wouldn't let those dreams die. I would use them to change my and Lily's fate. When I was 20, I decided to leave. I stood before Grandpa Harold, holding the notebook of his ideas, and said, "I'm going to make people know the name Harold Whitman." He looked at me, silent, but I saw a spark in his eyes. Not joy, but respect. I hugged Lily, promised I'd come back for her, and stepped out of the old wooden house, carrying a dream bigger than myself. Leaving my grandparents' house in North Carolina, I carried an old backpack, a few sets of clothes, and the worn leather notebook filled with Grandpa Harold's ideas. I didn't have much money, just enough for a bus ticket to Raleigh, where I'd heard there were emerging tech companies and opportunities for young dreamers. Inside me burned a fire, not just to prove myself, but to keep my promise to Grandpa Harold, to revive the dreams the world had buried. But standing at the Raleigh bus station, surrounded by bustling crowds and blaring car horns, I felt smaller than ever. I was only 20, with no degree, no experience, just a notebook full of formulas I didn't fully understand and a burning determination. I found a cheap, cramped room to rent on the outskirts of Raleigh, where the smell of old paint and the sound of neighbors' arguments seeped through thin walls. During the day, I worked at a computer repair shop, learning to assemble circuit boards and troubleshoot software issues. The job was monotonous, but it gave me access to computers, what Grandpa Harold had called the gateway to the future. At night, under the dim glow of a fluorescent light, I opened his notebook, trying to decipher his ideas about data systems and artificial intelligence. The numbers, charts, and scribbled notes were like a giant puzzle, both captivating and discouraging. I had no formal training, but I had time and patience, two things Grandpa Harold had taught me through years of iron discipline. I started with a small idea from the notebook, a data prediction algorithm based on his applied physics models. I wasn't sure what it could do, but it felt special, like an unpolished gem. I spent months coding, learning programming from borrowed library books and online forums. I slept little, ate haphazardly, and often wondered if I was chasing an impossible dream. But whenever I wanted to give up, I remembered the look in Grandpa Harold's eyes when I said I'd make the world know his name. I couldn't let him down. The first year was a string of failures. I took my algorithm to a tech conference in Raleigh where investors and engineers gathered to scout new ideas. Dressed in a threadbare suit, I stood before a group of skeptical faces and pitched my idea. A data prediction system based on applied physics, I said, trying to keep my voice steady despite trembling hands. But they cut me off. "What's your degree? Who's backing you? Has this been tested?" Their questions were like knife wounds. I left the conference feeling crushed, the notebook in my hands heavy as a reminder that I wasn't good enough. I tried again, this time with a small startup in Durham. They were more polite, but the outcome was the same. "Interesting idea, but too risky," they said. "You need real-world data, a team, capital." I had none of those things. I only had myself and Grandpa Harold's pages. I began to doubt, not him, but myself. Maybe I'd been naive, thinking a 20-year-old kid from a small town could achieve what the world had denied Grandpa Harold. But I didn't give up. I wrote to Lily every week, telling her about Raleigh, the exhausting work days, and the sleepless nights at the computer. "I'm trying, Lily," I wrote. "I'll come get you soon." Her letters kept me grounded. She wrote about school, the drawings she made, and how Grandpa Harold was still strict, but sometimes told her about his old inventions. "He says, you're smarter than he thought," she wrote in one letter, and I smiled, imagining him muttering it with his gruff expression. In my second year, I decided to build a prototype myself. I used all my savings from the repair shop to buy an old computer and the necessary components. I worked in my cramped room where my desk was a plank balanced on two cardboard boxes. I coded, tested, failed, and coded again. Some nights I collapsed on the desk, my mind spinning with lines of code that didn't work. Once I threw Grandpa Harold's notebook against the wall, shouting in frustration. But then I picked it up, dusted it off, and kept going. I wasn't just doing this for myself. I was doing it for him. For Grandma Margaret. For Lily. The turning point came on a rainy afternoon when I met a man named David at a Raleigh coffee shop. He was about 40, dressed in a casual jacket, but with sharp eyes that seemed to see through everything. I was sitting in a corner, poring over Grandpa Harold's notebook when he approached and asked, "What are you doing with all that paper? Looks like something from a mad scientist." I laughed, a bit embarrassed, then told him about my idea. Not the whole thing, just enough to avoid sounding like a dreamer. David listened without interrupting, then handed me his business card. "I'm a venture capitalist," he said. "Meet me at my office next week. Bring your idea." I went to the meeting with my heart pounding, bracing for another rejection. But David was different. He didn't ask about degrees or teams. He wanted to see my prototype. I presented my algorithm on the old computer, hands shaking. It wasn't perfect. The interface was rough, sometimes buggy, but David saw something in it. "This has potential," he said. "But you need a team, and you need me." He offered to invest $50,000, a fortune to me then, to build a full version. In return, he wanted 20% of a company I hadn't even imagined owning. I agreed and named the company Whitman Labs, a direct tribute to Grandpa Harold. With David's money, I rented a small corner in a shared office, hired 2 young programmers, and a data engineer. We worked day and night, turning the ideas in Grandpa Harold's notebook into reality. My algorithm started to work. It predicted data trends with astonishing accuracy, from financial markets to supply chains. But success didn't come easily. We faced system errors, pressure from David to launch early, and fierce competition from bigger companies. Once a potential client backed out of a deal at the last minute, making me think I'd failed completely. But then, when I was 24, everything exploded. A major logistics company in California tested our product and called it the future of the industry. The first contract brought in $200,000, then quickly millions. Whitman Labs became a name mentioned on tech forums. On the day I signed the first contract, I changed my name to Nathan Whitman, the name I chose to honor Grandpa Harold. After 4 grueling years of building a startup, I was no longer the kid from Chapel Hill. I became a self-made millionaire, standing among San Francisco's skyscrapers, where I moved to expand the company. Success came, but I didn't forget those who brought me here. I returned to North Carolina with a $500,000 check for Grandpa Harold. He sat in his old armchair, looked at the check, and pushed it back to me. "Keep it, Nathan," he said, his voice low. "Use it for those who need it more." I convinced him to keep a small portion, enough for him to live comfortably in a modest villa I bought near Raleigh, quiet with a garden like Grandma Margaret loved. The rest, as he wished, I donated to a local science school with one condition. They named the new lab Harold Whitman Lab. I also patented his unfinished ideas, listing both his name and mine as co-owners, Harold and Nathan Whitman. When I showed him the patent papers, he only nodded, but I saw his eyes glisten. It was the first time I felt he was truly proud of me. Lily was my top priority. I brought her to live in Raleigh, covering her tuition to attend the art school she dreamed of. Now 21, she still has Grandma Margaret's smile, but her eyes are deeper, as if the pain of those years left its mark. "You did it, Nate," she said when I showed her her new apartment. I hugged her, feeling relieved that I'd kept my promise. But success didn't erase old wounds. Every night, sitting in my office overlooking the San Francisco Bay, I think of Mom, Dad, Grandma Margaret, and Grandpa Harold. I've come a long way, but I know my journey isn't over. A part of me is still searching, not just for success, but for healing. San Francisco was a world apart from Chapel Hill or the cornfields at my grandparents' house. From my office on the 12th floor of Whitman Labs, I looked down at the bay where fog drifted lazily and ships silently cut through the water. My company now had over 50 employees, multi-million-dollar contracts, and a growing reputation. I, Nathan Whitman, at 27, was a name mentioned in tech magazines, transformed from an unknown kid into a pioneer in data analytics. But every time I gazed out the window as the city lights flickered in the night, I saw my mother's face. The way she looked the last time I saw her, sitting next to Mark in the car that drove away, leaving Lily and me behind like unwanted baggage. I tried not to think about her, but the memories surged back, sharp as a blade. I wondered where she was, how she was living, whether she ever regretted choosing Mark over us. The letters I wrote to her but never sent sat in my desk drawer, gathering dust, a reminder of the pain I'd never confronted. I had built an empire from nothing, but I couldn't rebuild the bridge that had burned between me and my mother. Lily, now 24, was my solace. She lived in Raleigh in her final year at an art school where she painted vibrant canvases that echoed Grandma Margaret's spirit: cornfields, sparrows, sunset afternoons. I visited her, often bringing small gifts and stories of San Francisco. She always smiled brightly, but sometimes I caught a fleeting sadness in her eyes, as if she too carried wounds we never spoke of. "Do you ever think about Mom?" she asked me once as we sat at a small diner near her school. I stopped chewing, staring out the window, not answering right away. "Sometimes," I said, my voice low, "but I don't know if she thinks about us." Lily nodded, saying nothing more, but I knew she was searching for something. Perhaps answers I didn't have. Then one day, Mom appeared. It was a Friday afternoon, and I was in a meeting with my engineering team at Whitman Labs. My assistant, Carrie, knocked on the door and whispered that a woman wanted to see me, saying it was personal. I frowned, thinking it might be a journalist or an unscheduled client. But when I stepped into the lobby, I saw her. My mother, Rachel, standing there, frail, her once golden hair now streaked with gray, her eyes tired, but still familiar. She wore an old coat, clutching a cloth bag as if it were the only thing keeping her upright. "Nathan," she said, her voice trembling, "I need to talk to you." I stood frozen, feeling time rewind to the day she left us behind. I wanted to turn away, to tell Carrie to send her out, but my feet wouldn't move. "Come to my office," I said, my voice colder than I intended. She followed, her steps slow, as if afraid I'd change my mind. In my office, she sat across from me, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. I don't know where to begin," she said.